Ain't no hatred of our brown brothers up in here. I love the Mexicans.
Yes, sir.
You didn't hear me.
Yes, sir.
I'm gonna say it again. I ain't hiding none of my feelings. I know who they are.
The year was 1609 on the rugged terrains of Veracruz, Mexico. The colonial power of Spain had had enough of a tribe known as the Cimarrones, or the Maroons, and their leader, an old warrior they called Yanga. With all their might and heavy artillery, the Spaniards were run off by the guerrilla tactics of the Maroons, forced to negotiate freedom with the very Africans they once enslaved. In this video, we will talk about the brutal history of slavery in Mexico, how they ended up with over 200,000 African slaves, and why African Americans and Mexicans have so much in common. Do you think slaves were treated better in Mexico than in America? Stick around to the end to find out. Make sure you hit those like, share, and subscribe buttons. The history of chattel slavery in Mexico is a multifaceted narrative that intervenes with the broader history of the Atlantic slave trade and the Spanish colonial empire. But why were slaves needed in Mexico? If you didn't know, Spanish is not the native language of Mexico. The language, as well as Catholicism, was forced upon them by the Empire of Spain. The colonization began with the arrival of the Spanish conquistador, Hernán Cortés, in 1519. Prior to his arrival, Mexico was home to numerous advanced civilizations, including the Aztec, Maya, Mixtec, and Zapotec. The Aztec Empire, centered in Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, had complex social structures, sophisticated agricultural systems, impressive architectural achievements, and rich cultural traditions. Tenochtitlan, with its sprawling temples and bustling markets, was a marvel, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of the Aztec people. The Aztec Empire grew, city by city, through blood and gold. Their rulers were seen as gods among men, guiding their people with a divine mandate. The Aztecs were builders of dreams. Their architecture, grand and imposing, reflected their vision of the cosmos. They were also masterful traders, their markets teeming with goods from the farthest reaches of their empire. The Aztecs' culture, rich and complex, was woven from the threads of art, astronomy, and ritual. They crafted intricate calendars, blending the cycles of the sun and the sacred, guiding their lives by the stars. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Aztec Empire was a colossus, casting a long shadow over central Mexico. But within its grandeur lay the seeds of its downfall. The empire's reliance on tribute and its relentless conquests sowed discontent among the subjugated. The arrival of Hernán Cortés in 1519 was not merely a meeting of worlds, but a clash of destinies. Hernán Cortés landed on the eastern coast of Mexico and began his expedition inland. His small force of around 600 men, aided by native allies and superior weaponry, managed to forge alliances with various indigenous groups who were enemies of the Aztecs. The conquest culminated in the siege of the Aztec capital in 1521. The Spanish victory was facilitated by the spread of diseases like smallpox. Sounds familiar, right? The fallen empire and conquered lands were renamed New Spain. It encompassed not only present-day Mexico, but also large parts of what are now the southwestern United States, Central America, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. And like any newly acquired land, it needed a lot of work. The Spaniards believed that conquering the Aztecs would grant them access to large amounts of gold, silver, and other valuable resources. Their plans were to subjugate their indigenous captives of war into a labor force for their enterprises, providing a steady stream of wealth flowing back to Spain. As the Spanish settled in New Spain, they brought with them some Bantu African workers as slaves. This would be a glimpse of things to come. Want good luck? Share this video with 5 people for good luck for the next 5 years. In 1542, the Spanish crown prohibited the enslavement of indigenous people, but that did not include Bantu African workers. The economy of New Spain was heavily based on mining, particularly silver extraction. The discovery of rich silver deposits transformed New Spain into one of the wealthiest and most important colonies in the Spanish Empire. Silver mining required a large labor force, and with the indigenous people no longer available, the Spaniards turned their eyes to the west coast of Africa. The transatlantic slave trade was a massive and brutal enterprise. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homeland, transported across the Atlantic Ocean under horrific conditions, and sold into slavery in the Americas. New Spain became a significant destination for African slaves.
Men and women were separated. Men typically were held in the lower belly of the ship. The roof, if you would, was quite low, probably about 4 feet high. So people couldn't stand. African men were shackled together and they were packed so closely together in a spoon-like position. And they would stay like that for pretty much the entire journey.
The Middle Passage, the transatlantic journey from Africa to the Americas, was notorious for its brutality. Slaves were packed tightly into the holds of ships, with little room to move and inadequate provisions. Their journey could take several weeks to months, during which many slaves succumbed to disease, malnutrition, and mistreatment. It is estimated that up to 20% of the slaves did not survive the voyage. Those who did survive were tasked with being the driving force behind building this arm of the Spanish Empire. African slaves brought to Mexico primarily came from West Africa and the Congo-Angola region. They were captured through warfare, raids, and trading networks that extended deep into the African interior. Once captured, they were marched to coastal slave forts, where they were held until they could be loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. Upon arrival in the ports of Veracruz and Acapulco, the primary entry points for African slaves in Mexico, they were sold at auctions to colonial settlers, mine owners, plantation owners, and other wealthy individuals. Slaves from Africa were considered the means to satisfy the demand for labor to develop new lands. Both male and female Africans were enslaved. Males were used for field labor and physical trades. While women were sometimes used in the field, they also filled numerous domestic service positions, acting as wet nurses, washerwomen, cooks, maids, seamstresses, or personal caregivers of masters and mistresses. The work assigned to African slaves in Mexico varied depending on the region and the economic activities predominant in that area. In regions like Veracruz and Oaxaca, African slaves were primarily used on sugar plantations. The cultivation and processing of sugarcane were labor-intensive and required a large, steady workforce. Africans worked long hours under the harsh tropical sun, often from dawn till dusk, with minimal rest and inadequate nutrition. Many Spaniards deemed the Africans more capable slaves than the indigenous because, unlike the indigenous people, the Africans thrived in the harsh work conditions. However, the grueling nature of the work, combined with the tropical diseases prevalent in these regions, resulted in high mortality rates among slaves. The silver mines of Zacatecas and other areas were another major destination for African slaves. Mining was perilous work. Slaves were required to extract ore from deep within the earth, often using primitive tools and working in dangerous conditions. The risk of cave-ins, exposure to toxic substances, and respiratory diseases were constant threats. Despite the high mortality rate, the Spanish colonial authorities and mine owners continued to import slaves to meet the labor demands of the lucrative mining industry. Many African slaves were also used as domestic servants in the homes of wealthy colonists. These slaves performed a variety of tasks, including cooking, cleaning, and caring for children. Although domestic slaves generally faced less physically demanding labor compared to those in agriculture and mining, they were still subject to the whims and abuses of their owners. Female slaves, in particular, were vulnerable to sexual exploitation and abuse. There were many elements that differ when comparing slavery in New Spain versus chattel slavery in America. One of those differences was that African slaves were at least considered human and had some workers' rights. Under Spanish colonial law, African slaves were considered the personal property of their owners. This legal status meant that slaves had no personal rights and were subject to the absolute authority of their masters. They could be bought, sold, traded, or inherited, much like livestock. However, the colonial legal system included regulations intended to protect slaves from extreme abuse, but these laws were often poorly enforced. The enforcement of these laws was inconsistent, and the exploitation of slaves continued largely unchecked. Despite this, slaves under the colonial legal system could file a complaint for harsh work conditions and mistreatment, which at the very least granted them some rights within society. Socially, African slaves occupied the lowest rung of the colonial hierarchy. They were considered inferior to both Europeans and indigenous people, and this social status was reinforced by pervasive racial prejudices. Despite this, there were instances of social mobility and integration, particularly through intermarriage and manumission. Despite the harsh conditions and legal constraints, African slaves in Mexico resisted their oppression in various ways. Many slaves engaged in subtle forms of resistance, such as working slowly, feigning illness, or sabotaging equipment. These acts of defiance, while often small and individual, collectively undermined the productivity and authority of slave owners. There were also more overt forms of resistance. One notable example was the Yanga Rebellion of 1570. Enjoying our content? Consider becoming a member by clicking that join button. Your contributions help us continue to take deep dives into Black history. Gaspar Yanga was an African prince from the region now known as Gabon. Yanga was captured and sold into slavery, enduring the horrific Middle Passage before arriving in New Spain sometime in the mid-16th century. Yanga escaped from a sugar plantation in Veracruz around 1570. Along with a group of fellow enslaved Africans, he fled into the dense mountains near Veracruz. There, Yanga and his followers established a community, a settlement of escaped slaves, known as cimarrones, or Maroons. By the early 1600s, Yanga's Maroon community had grown significantly, posing a threat to Spanish colonial interests. In 1609, the Spanish colonial government decided to put an end to the Maroon settlement. They dispatched a well-armed expedition to crush the Yanga rebellion and recapture the escaped slaves. Yanga, now an elderly man, but still a formidable leader, prepared his community for the impending attack. He proposed a strategic plan that included guerrilla warfare tactics, capitalizing on the familiarity of the mountainous terrain. Yanga and the Maroons, armed with rudimentary weapons and makeshift defenses, fiercely resisted the Spanish forces. The initial encounter resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Despite their limited resources, the Maroons managed to inflict heavy losses on the Spanish. Yanga's leadership and the tenacity of his followers forced the Spanish to realize that a military victory would be costly and difficult. Recognizing the resilience of the determination of Yanga and his community, the Spanish eventually decided to negotiate. In 1618, a treaty was reached that granted the Maroons semi-autonomous status. The Spanish agreed to recognize the freedom of Yanga and his followers and to grant them a piece of land where they could establish their own settlement. The settlement, known as San Lorenzo de los Negros, became one of the first free African communities in the Americas. Today, the city is simply known as Yanga. The abolishment of slavery. Unlike chattel slavery in the Americas, slavery in New Spain, by all accounts, seemed to be a means to an end. One of the earliest calls for the end of slavery in Mexico came from the Catholic Church. Influential figures such as Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas advocated for the rights of indigenous people and African slaves, arguing that all humans were equal in the eyes of God. The Mexican War of Independence was a turning point in the fight against slavery. The decade-long war, sparked by a desire for Mexico to break free from Spanish colonial rule, was characterized by a strong emphasis on social justice and equality. The father of Mexican independence, Miguel Hidalgo, issued the Grito de Dolores in 1810, calling for an end to Spanish rule and the abolition of slavery. Although Hidalgo's revolt was quickly suppressed, his call for abolition resonated with many Mexicans, particularly those of mixed African and indigenous descent. The fight for independence continued under the leadership of José María Morelos, another priest who championed the cause of social equality. In his 1813 document, Sentiments of the Nation, Morelos declared that slavery should be abolished. However, it was not until Mexico achieved independence in 1821 that significant steps were taken toward the formal abolition of slavery. The final push for the abolition of slavery in Mexico came under the leadership of Vicente Guerrero, a national hero of African descent who became president of Mexico in 1829. Guerrero, who had fought alongside Morelos during the War of Independence, was committed to ending the institution of slavery. On September 15, 1829, President Guerrero issued a decree abolishing slavery in Mexico. The decree stated that all slaves within the territory of the Mexican Republic were free, and that any further importation of slaves was prohibited. This landmark decree effectively ended the legal institution of chattel slavery in Mexico, although the transition of freedom was a complex and protracted process. Mexico abolished slavery almost 35 years before the U.S. Africans and their influence over the centuries have become integral parts of Mexico's heritage and culture. African rhythms and dance forms have influenced traditional Mexican music and dance styles, such as the son jarocho from Veracruz and the chilena from Guerrero. Instruments like the marimba and the cajon, which have African origins, are integral to these musical traditions. African culinary practices have also left their mark on Mexican cuisine. Dishes like the mondongo and caldo de camarón have roots in African cooking techniques and ingredients. The syncretic religious practices that blend Catholicism and African spiritual traditions are evident in most Mexican communities. These practices include veneration of saints and the celebration of religious festivals with African-inspired rituals and music. Afro-Mexican communities, particularly in regions like Veracruz, Costa Chica, and Guerrero, have preserved their unique cultural heritage while also contributing to the broader Mexican culture. These communities maintain traditions such as music, dance, cuisine, and religious practices that reflect their African ancestry. The history of chattel slavery in Mexico is a complex and often painful narrative marked by exploitation, resistance, and resilience. The arrival of African slaves, their treatment under the brutal chattel system, and their eventual emancipation are all integral parts of this history. Despite the hardships faced by African slaves and their descendants, their contributions have had a lasting impact on Mexican society. The recognition of Afro-Mexican communities and their cultural heritage is a testament to the enduring legacy of those who endured and resisted the horrors of slavery. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the contributions of African Mexicans to the nation's history and culture. The Mexican government officially recognized Afro-Mexicans as a distinct ethnic group in the 2020 census, a significant step toward acknowledging their historical and cultural significance. As Mexico continues to reckon with its past, the story of chattel slavery serves as a reminder of the importance of justice, equality, and the recognition of the diverse contributions that have shaped the nation's history.